Wir selbst
I live in an area with agricultural farming, so the bark beetle is a known problem. And even though large parts of the forests in Germany are still labeled as healthy, it's a big problem. We could just plant a lot of more trees and the problem would be solved. But how and if that's possible that easily, and how the state of our forest actually is currently, is what Kirsten is going to tell us now. Kirsten, glad you're here. She's a scientist, geology PhD, and she is doing her PhD on forests. It's something you usually do from the height point of view of a satellite. She also won a prize for her master thesis. We're happy that you're here, and we're looking forward to your talk. A warm applause for Kirsten.
Unsere Wälder brennen.
Our forests are burning. Last year in Canada, more than 18 million acres of forest burned down. We had the worst forest fires since 2 decades. In Germany, the bark beetle killed the national park of the Harz. And those images remind us painfully of this problem. At the same time, climate change is happening. It's the warmest year since records started, and the consequences in Germany as well as all over the world can be observed, which means we need to do something. And in all this chaos, people start saying, well, let's just plant trees and counteract this whole dynamic. Not just private companies, but also state actors like Germany, who did the Bonn challenge a few years ago and wants to plant large amount of acres by 2030. So how does that fit together? Are trees the problem or the solution? What's the role the forests are playing in all of this and the climate crisis? I can tell you the forest is not the hero of this story. But we cannot talk about the climate crisis without the forest because it's playing a key role. Why do I want to talk about this? My motivation for this talk comes from you, the chaos community. In the last years of the Congress, I talked to some of you, and when I work, I always arrived at this question. But I also realized a lot of you have an image in your heads about my work, and it looks more or less like this. I stroll through the endless German forests looking for some sort of signal, and that happens less frequently than one hopes. My friends think I just go hiking most of the time and get paid for that. My family thinks I run through the forests with GPS and measure things, but what I do is a lot closer to what you do. I mainly sit at a computer and push code from left to right and hope something happens. When I go out, I actually go into those areas of the forest that most people don't like to visit because I do my PhD on disturbances and forest regeneration, which means I understand how a forest works, but I'm not an expert on carbon sequestration in forests or on afforestation techniques. Nevertheless, I feel this topic deserves being summarized and shown in broad strokes, and I thought that can't be that bad. I should have known better. Because when we're talking about forests, we're also talking about people. And if we have people in systems, the whole thing becomes complex quickly. And ecosystems themselves are quite complex. The combination of both does not give you easy answers. And that's why we're going to start with episode 1, The Dark Menace. That's, as you might have imagined, the climate crisis. One central process is underneath the climate crisis, the carbon cycle. We need to understand broadly what's happening. So where does carbon actually get stored in large quantities? We have the reservoirs of oil, gas, and charcoal. The biggest storage system is the ocean. We have the atmosphere, which also stores a lot of carbon, but too much of it is a problem. And then we have the terrestrial storage areas in the ground. So this idea, we plant trees and they contain all the carbon, that doesn't really work. Yes, they contain a lot of carbon, but the actual ground, the actual soil is what really gets you. Forests take care of carbon storing in the soil. Actual moors are the largest storage areas for carbon. But all of this wouldn't be a cycle if things wouldn't flow from A to B. The biggest flow in this system is caused by us, humans, which are emissions by burning fossil resources. There's another flow, which comes from the usage of the land, and that mainly comes from deforestation. So the carbon isn't where it used to be, but it needs to go somewhere. Roughly 1/3 is absorbed by the oceans. Half of the emissions stay in the atmosphere, and there they also create the problem because they contribute to global warming. And the rest is absorbed by vegetation, and there mainly by forests. We as humans influence this cycle, so we can also manipulate it. The rest of this talk, we're going to ignore all the rest and focus on the terrestrial systems, and especially the forests. But there's, of course, a lot more. This is just one option. The first option, we can't, this means we need to stop deforestation. I have good news. The highest rate of deforestation we had in the 80s and 90s. Since then, deforestation rates are decreasing. So this is good news. And as you can see, in the northern hemisphere, forests actually increase. But we're still losing forests. That's still a problem. We're producing more emissions, and we're also losing storage areas. You need to understand most of the deforestation happens in the tropical regions, not in Europe. What's also important to understand is that's not necessarily by illegal deforestation. The most important factor is changing forests into agricultural areas. There are 3 central goods which contribute a lot. First is soy, cattle, and palm oil plantations. So why don't these countries with tropical forests can't manage to stop deforestation? We need to be careful because Europe did the same thing a few centuries ago, which is why there aren't that many forests in Europe. And also, a lot of this deforestation is driven by international trade. That soy from Brazil is imported into Europe and used here and fed to cattle here. That's a problem. because we're exporting the usage of areas and also the deforestation. It's a big problem, but it also allows us to exert influence through our consumption, but also through logistics. We can influence this deforestation. The other lever that we have is to reduce the sinks that we have. There is one mechanism nature already contains, which would be negative emissions bound by nature, photosynthesis. One of the oldest processes we have in the planet, and it's the basics for life. We could make some excursus here. First is the harvesting of wood, and we could build buildings with that, which would store the carbon. Or we could optimize our forest management in a way that the existing forests store more carbon. But if we just focus on increasing the area of forests, that has the biggest potential for storing carbon emissions. Meaning, we as humans influence the cycle, but it's also influenced by something else, and that would be natural disturbances, fires, storms, and bark beetles. These natural disturbances already existed. Currently, they're present, and they're always going to be present in the future. We try to suppress them, but I don't know many cases where this actually worked over an extended period of time. And basically, that's not a problem. We just need to establish one basic concept. Dead trees does not mean that the forest, the ecosystem is dead. It's counterintuitive, because when we think of forests where we grew up and where we go back as adults, it's very hard for us to imagine that those forests might not be there at some point. And we need to understand that forests live in different timescales as us humans, and they are made up of living organisms, of trees, which die. And that's not a problem. The forest just falls back into an earlier stadium of its development, and then trees and organisms start to grow from the beginning again. And from that stadium, they can progress into an actual forest as we know it. Let's look into an example.
And you might remember the years from the news from the 90s or 80s, where the bark beetle has attacked the Bavarian forest, and people were afraid that this national park would be lost finally. And as I said, trees regrow, but does it happen when the destruction is so massive? And because of the pre-planning, which meant that we didn't need to do that much, because 30 years later we can look at how everything developed. And the good news is the forest is growing again, and it is happening with our interference. And the data is from the core zone of the national park, when no one has planted anything. And we see today that the Bavarian forest looks like this. And I would like to make the careful prognosis that it will look like this also in the Harz forest in a couple of years. And we can learn something from this, that the forest is a dynamic carbon storage medium. So that means it grows, it saves carbon, and then there's a disturbance, and that means that carbon is released to the atmosphere. And the interesting thing is that this disturbance is never destroying all trees. There are always some trees that survive, even with great forests, with great fires. There are some surviving trees. And based on that, we can the forest is growing, and in the first decade, it's absorbing a lot more carbon. And after about 30 years in European forest, then the forest has dimensions that are able to store carbon like forests that were not disturbed. And that means that we are only looking at forests for a short span of time. Then that's the wrong approach. We need to look at forests on longer time spans. And what I actually want to say, it's not a bug, it's a feature. And it's a really cool feature because disturbances are inducing biodiversity, and they make it possible that new species can establish themselves in these ecosystems, and there are species that develop that are adapting to these disturbances. For example, this tree, we have these trees which need fire so that the seeds can be spread. And the whole thing happens in the context of climate change. And yes, of course, if forests are disturbed, then the climate change is being driven by forests being disturbed. And we also know that with this changing climate, we have more disturbances, which is a positive feedback loop. But there is also the chance that the fire burns more intensively, and the bark beetles have better opportunities to procreate in these times. But if this is a fundamental problem of the ecosystem, in the sense of we are losing the forest, this is something that we cannot answer with certainty yet. That can be different from region on the planet to different regions. And there might be some new disturbances that come to our forests. And another aspect is what kind of actions we as humans do in these forests. And the future of our forests and of climate change becomes less and less certain. But there are also some opportunities to fight, to deal with climate change.
And with that, I want to start into episode 2. So now you understand, okay, it doesn't seem to be all that straightforward, but what's possible? How much carbon can we take out of the atmosphere by planting trees? I brought some numbers from the IPCC, the World Climate Council of Scientists, which summarized the current state of climate research and communicated to the public. And the potential they calculated is 9.2 gigatons of carbon dioxide, with a range between 0.5 and, sorry, dropped the number. So those numbers don't tell us that much. Let's take a relation. What are the yearly emissions? I think it's quite clear that this idea, oh, we just need to plant more trees and then we can do this, we can solve the climate crisis, that's not going to work. Because if we don't reduce current emissions, even if we reach the maximum potential of trees, we're not even getting near capturing current emissions, let alone taking enough emissions out of the atmosphere to cool down the planet. Maybe you ask yourself, factor 20? That's quite a range for a process that we should understand quite well. But the insecurity that's in those numbers comes because the studies that are beneath those numbers have different assumptions. For instance, how much money does it cost to a forest? How much area do we have to put trees on? For the current budget, we're mobilizing 1.9 gigatons of carbon dioxide. So there is potential. Why aren't we using it? And I am imagining perhaps two entities that know the human species well are also asking themselves that. So I invite you to read. Well, what are we supposed to do, R2D2? The climate crisis is at some point the end of humanity. I know that planting trees is a good idea, but humans just can't get it done. Sure, we need to help them, but we can't put the evox everywhere. So why is it that difficult to plant a forest? You know one reason, that's the non-permanence. If you plant a forest, doesn't mean that a forest remains in that place. Natural disturbances, but humans as well. A hypothetical example, who guarantees that not someone comes by and says, hey, I'm going to build a street here, build a road. And we also need to take into account environmental constraints. One topic is the albedo. That's the ratio between incoming and reflected solar emissions that leaves the Earth again or that arrives on Earth. You can see that forests have a low albedo. They absorb a lot of energy. That means if we put forests in areas with lighter surfaces, then the potential of storing carbon dioxide is offset by less cooling effects from darker surfaces. You could actually have a net warming and not cooling effect by putting a forest on a light surface. Another topic is the concept of reforestation versus afforestation. We use them synonymously, but they're quite different. Reforestation means planting forests where there were already forests. Afforestation means putting trees where there weren't any trees before. And that could make a lot of a difference. Let's look at it. South Africa, in a time of 20 years, with a lot of effort, planted plantations of trees on 1 million acres. Unfortunately, 50% of those plantations burned down in the same time. Put trees into a system which was savanna or steppe before, which is full of fires, and the biomass of plantation burns a lot better and carries the further than the original vegetation, so it makes the problem worse. We need to figure out, if we put forests into systems where there weren't any forests, they're interacting with pre-existing processes. There was a reason why there weren't any forests there in the first place. So what we should take away is reforestation should always be preferred over afforestation. There are cases where afforestation could make sense because also the environmental constraints change, but we need to be careful. The second topic is differentiating natural forests versus plantations. I brought you an example from Chile. Chile put a lot of resources in the last 2 decades to cover large parts of the country with plantations. Economical reasons, because the industry is using that wood, but they also said, oh great, that's good for the climate. We're putting forests, they store carbon dioxide, awesome. But Chile had problems with forest fires as well. So the question presented itself, are those forests increasing or decreasing carbon dioxide? And a study from this year did a bottom line for this. And they differentiated between native forests and plantations. And the x-axis, you see the balance sheet of carbon dioxide, y-axis, sorry. And as you can see, natural forests reduce carbon dioxide, take it out of the atmosphere and store it. But plantations can actually increase carbon dioxide. That could also be because the plantations burn a lot more, burn down a lot more on average. The fire has been stopped by areas where there was nothing to burn before, whereas the forests kind of carry the fire across the landscape. And they're also often just cut down quickly. In Chile, they're put into short-lived products like paper, which are also used quite quickly. The good news is Chile understood this, and they prefer natural forest systems nowadays, which is good. But there are other reasons as well why there are some forests in some areas, and that's because humans live and work there. If we put trees onto those areas, it could happen that those farmers say, well, I'll go somewhere else. And in the worst case, they cut down trees there to farm there, especially when it's subsistence agriculture and people need to live directly off the land because they plant their food. That's obvious. And it's a big problem telling them, you shouldn't do this. You need to conserve the forest to store carbon dioxide. And they're saying, like, what the heck? What are we supposed to do? Land is a scarce resource, and it's used. So if we say we want to do something else with that land, there is the potential for conflict, and there's trade-offs, and we need to keep this in mind when we act in some way. If we do something in one area, we need to be careful that not something happens in another area. So you can see, just planting trees doesn't cut it. Talking about planting trees, there are always those initiatives that say, we planted so and so many million trees. And my first question is, that's great. How many of those trees survived? Unfortunately, a surprising number of initiatives and projects plant millions of trees, and they never monitor what happens to those trees afterwards. And if they all dry out or get eaten by animals afterwards, nothing is won, because the forest stores carbon dioxide, not the number of planted trees. Meaning, don't let those big numbers dazzle you. It's about how much area is covered by actual forests. That's a bit gloomy, and you feel like, how are we supposed to do this? So in that context, I would like to emphasize, forests are the mechanism we understand best to change. And it's also the cheapest currently that we have. That means it does make sense to plant forests. And we need money for that. And in this whole confusion, the concept of certificates came into being. I'll just run through quickly. We have companies or individuals which produce emissions. They try to reduce them as much as possible, but quite often there's a lot left over. They pay another party which will reforest or afforest some area. A forest grows that can be offset with the original emissions because it stores the carbon dioxide. In an ideal world, this concept could make sense and would be cool, but we're not living in an ideal world. Maybe you can understand that this could be problematic at different points. First, those planted trees need to become forests that actually store the carbon dioxide. And the companies or individuals which pay for the reforestation also need to work on reducing their emissions, because remember, we can plant as many trees as we want. If we don't reduce the emissions, it's not going to do much. The whole thing can be frustrating, disillusioning, and that's why we're starting with episode 3.
And in this context, it is important to emphasize that I talked about forests as carbon storage, but forests are more than just carbon storage. They are habitats and spaces where different species can live. They give a lot of people access to drinking water, and a lot of areas on this planet would not be habitable if we didn't have the forests. And they are providing this really great resource, which is wood, which is very cool, but which is also more sustainable than steel or cement. And the good news is the forest is also returning. In Europe, we have, in the last 30 years, we have 19 million hectares regained. This is an area greater than the Baltic states. And the even better message is, and this is happening on its own, about 66% of this regeneration is due to natural processes, and this is not something that humans have done. The forest has simply taken back the area. And there are these win-win cases that people really like to mention when people say, yes, let's plant some trees. There are these projects and initiatives where they take care of ecosystem integrity, and they try to be congruent with the environment, and they also have the motivation to take care of the forest long term. And I want to mention the Nature-Based Solutions Initiative from the Oxford University, and they also look at case studies and to see where we see that things went right. And yeah, for example, this case. At the end, I would like to agree on a few things. One thing is that the climate crisis, that it's such a complex problem that let's plant some trees it's not an adequate solution. And this is more a societal, not a technical problem. And we actually do know what we need to do, and our task is to use our resources for the right purposes. And in this context, we can create a pyramid of actions. People like pyramids these days. The first thing should be to reduce our fossil emissions, because everything else that we do otherwise will have no real benefit if we don't do that. And then we have to prevent loss of forests, because then we're losing our sinks, and also we are releasing more carbon. And we can plant trees, or we can plant forests and also leave them alone afterwards. And then we still have the option of storing garbage, using wood, and improving forest management. But that should be the priorities. That should be the priority. And what we need are investments. We need forest that is used for these purposes. And we must prevent abuse so that companies cannot do greenwashing. And I want to do a shout out to the German Umwelthilfe. They are suing companies who are doing greenwashing, and they are acting as a good actor in this case. We need good accounting standards. According to my knowledge, there is no unified method which we can use to evaluate if a forest project is climate positive and that there is no damage to the local population and that there are not other negative consequences. Yes, evaluation of such a project is it's important, because then we know if it's worthwhile to invest money. I was in the climate conference in Baku this year. There was this initiative to have a unified carbon market, but it would be, yeah, so it's a step in the right direction to unify things, but yeah, not enough. And we need governance monitoring, which means that we have targeted approaches, that we ensure that people actually adhere to the standards, that we do monitoring, and ideally the people who do the monitoring are not the same people who actually execute the projects, because this would cause conflict of interest. But one thing I can tell you is, if the whole thing is too cheap, then I would be skeptical, because it's not only about planting the trees, but it's also about long-term care of the forests. Science is fortunately a team sport. I would like to thank my colleagues and friends, and the slides and the sources are in this GitHub repository. And finally, I would like to say, may the forest be with you. Vielen Dank.
Thanks for this great talk. I could continue to listen to you for 3 hours. How lovely. We have a little bit of time for 1 or 2 questions. Microphone 2. Can you hear me? I have one question. You mentioned in the points what we're supposed to do, which would be forest management. So you studied forest management. My question is there a study for what happens if you just leave the forest alone? Couldn't we just leave it be? Versus some sort of management. What's the effect on the amount of storage of carbon emissions? One of my colleagues is doing the research on that, so I don't know yet. There are studies which point to different directions. That's the difficult field. Let's leave the forests be. Nature knows best, because, well, it evolved over all the centuries in these systems, versus humans need to help the system, following the idea that climate crisis is accelerating. The changes we can observe in the environment are so much quicker than ever before, and potentially we need to help a bit. Those are the 2 different extreme points we hear today. I can't give you a clear answer. I suspect the answer is somewhere in the middle. We should look at what do natural forests do, what can we learn from it, but probably it makes sense if we help the forests a little bit, just because they need to deal with such an accelerated speed of change. One quick question, microphone 1. Is it a yes or no question? No, but it's quick. So how can I set off my next flight to Thailand? The answer is, ideally, you reduce your emissions by not taking your flight. I don't want to stand here and say, it's all up to you, just don't consume anything, because that's not the final solution to the problem. So if you decide that's something I want to do, then just decide that. You put part of your money in compensation projects, but they don't have to be forests either. My goal was to give you a bit of background knowledge so you can make better decisions. If you want to invest a bit of money, you have a better judgment on what are those people doing. They plant trees, do they give background, are they transparent, how they calculate the whole thing, and then you need to make your own decision if you want to put money into that or not. Thanks. And with that, Thanks to you, Kirsten. A big applause. Thanks for listening to the